everybody, and welcome once again to the Open Mic Writers in Their Own Words. I'm your host, Rich Eisen, and if you're a regular viewer of the show, you know that this is the program where every episode I talk to a writer about their work, about the publishing industry, as I always say, how they do what they do. And I'm really excited today. I've got a great guest. He is considered by many people to be one of the best crime fiction authors working in the world today. I read his book, What We Reckon, a few years ago, and it knocked my socks off. So I was thrilled recently to actually get to meet him in person at Boucheron in San Diego, and even more excited when he agreed to come on the open mic to talk about his latest book, Something Bad Wrong. I'm fully ensconced in that one right now, and I can honestly say it is just great stuff. He has earned his rep, let me tell you. So please welcome Eryk Pruitt to the open mic. Thanks for being here, Eryk. How are you doing today?
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Rich. I'm doing great today. I don't know what it's looking like out there in your part of the world, but today it's 81 degrees here in North Carolina.
Oh, well, it will be about 70 so here in a little bit, but this morning it was cold. I was out walking with my dogs this morning, and as I always do, right a little bit before sunrise, and it was about 30 degrees. So people think it never gets cold in California, and let me tell you, you're wrong. It does get cold here. Before I start, too, some people have asked me, why are you always drinking coffee or drinking something when you're talking to people? Well, it's because, I talk a lot. And when I do, I need something to keep my vocal cords working. So that's why, folks. That's why I'm always drinking coffee. So enjoy your beverage of choice and listen to the show, right? In any case, Eryk, let's start with the new book. Like I say, I'm familiar with it because I'm reading it right now. But for the uninitiated, give us a little bit of information about it. I know it came out earlier this year. Yeah, just give us the 411 on it and we can talk about it a little bit more from there.
Well, it's called Something Bad Wrong, and it is a story told in dual timelines about an unsolved murder. It's known in a small border town between North Carolina and Virginia as the Christmas Eve murders of 1972, in which a storied deputy named James Ballard picks up the case at the same time he is given an early onset Alzheimer's diagnosis. Then you fast forward 50 years, and his granddaughter has found his notebook, and she is producing a true crime podcast about why those murders weren't solved, and she finds out all kinds of hidden secrets.
Well, I there's a couple things about it that really got me. Well, first of all, though, before I get into the nuts and bolts of the story, I understand this was inspired by a true event that you were involved in. Is that true?
Yes, I worked for 2.5 years producing a podcast about an unsolved 50-year-old murder in our community. And after about 6 months of our own investigation, we started working with the Orange County Sheriff's Office out here in North Carolina, sharing information. And we in our podcast, it's called The Long Dance. It's an 8 episode investigatory true crime podcast. We were the first persons to ever publicly identify suspects, and we were given complete access to the case. And in our investigations, we actually collected DNA from suspects and from the family of suspects. We actually interviewed the main suspect with hidden cameras and hidden microphones. The police and media had never talked to him before, been able to talk to him before, but we did. And then we published our story, and it's still available wherever you get your podcast.
The DA declined to pursue that case, correct?
It did. He did. He felt that what he told us was he needed either forensic evidence, fingerprints or DNA. We did collect DNA. We did have it analyzed. The DNA, of course, when it was collected in 1971, was, they didn't know anything about DNA back then, so they didn't store it in order to preserve it. I do believe one day they're going to come up with technology that will be able to take what remnants of DNA were on there, but wasn't yet. He also either wanted a confession or a witness. And we were able to find a copycat crime that we believe was done by the same guy. And we go into that, but still the DA didn't think there was enough to extradite the killer, who after we interviewed him had moved away to Florida.
Wow, that's really something. I mean, I think a lot of every crime author has to come up with a crime, an idea for a crime and a plot to follow that through. You had one right there. I mean, I know you did the podcast. Did you ever think about doing a book as well, or was it better for you to just go this way?
Yeah, I would have loved to have done a book. I pitched it, I tried it, but the problem with the publishers that we approached, was it was pretty much right across the board. They want a case they want to write about a case that's been tried in court, and that there's somebody in jail for, and this was something where, the guy got away, and they weren't, those don't really get any attention from, American publishers.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It's been this way in American media stuff for a long time. You always got to get the bad guy, and the bad guy's got to get theirs in the end. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way a lot of the time here in reality. My brother was a cop for a long time, so I'm very familiar with that scenario playing itself out.
Yeah, it's either that or they want, the story of a conviction overturned or whatever. But, something never goes to court for some reason. They don't find it interesting. When personally, I think that says more about the American justice system. The ones that, they're unsolved for a reason. Right. What is the reason? That's kind of what we go into in the podcast, because there were so many podcasts out there that just say, "Our cops are bad," or like, tragedy porn for women or whatever. And we knew with what little there was and what little we had in the beginning, our focus was, well, it went unsolved for a reason, or several reasons, many reasons. Let's talk about all of those, and most importantly, the lives of all of the people that were touched by this crime. Because there were a lot of survivors, there were a lot of cops, generations of cops who this was their one case, and they were never able to let it go. And to talk to these these men like 50 years later, about how they were never able to let it go. And that to me was super compelling, that some of these men had very storied careers and did a lot of good, but the fact that this was never solved just haunted them. And it's great to hear their stories.
And it's an interesting thing too. I think a lot of folks maybe don't think about this when they think about law enforcement, but cops want to solve cases. And detectives want to solve cases. I think there's so much chatter now these days about law enforcement, and I get it. Like I said, my brother was a cop. I have many friends who've served in law enforcement, various capacities, and I get it. But real cops want to solve real cases, and when they don't solve one, it does haunt them, because I think the best cops out there are driven by that need to bring justice to victims of crimes, and when, regardless of whatever the circumstances are, that doesn't happen, it is something they just never ever forget. And so that's one of the things that I love about the story. I think you've really captured very well the emotions that that people carry sometimes decades after a crime has faded out of the public eye. And along those lines, excuse me, I'm a big fan of stories that are told in dual timelines, but they are hard to get right. They're really tricky, and mostly because I grew up in the 70s. I was a teenager in the 70s, and so I remember very distinctly certain things, right? But there are so many little details you have to get right when you're going to go back and tell a story and place it 50 years ago. How was the handling the dual timelines for you here? Did it entail a lot more research for you to make sure you had all those little details correct?
No, I mean, we, in researching that case, we talked to a lot of people, and there would be things that when they were talking about their everyday life, there were things that were just so different from ours that it would stick in my head. And so it would be, how can I put how can I work that into the story? Like, it's hard for me to come up with an example off the top of my head, but one that did flag was parking. Like I'd even talk to like younger folk these days and ask like, do you go parking? I mean, I know we did it when I was younger. I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s, where you just go take your car and park it somewhere and do some smooching for a bit. But like, they don't really do that anymore. This is not a big culture where you take your car and go find a cul-de-sac and do your smooching. So, what that was a big impetus for, both the investigation and my fiction there. So, you would put that in. The other, of course, being payphones, the lack of instant communication, and like how much we take that for granted now. Like a big part of the reason why the crime wasn't solved in real life and in a fictional version is because, cops did not communicate with each other, in between jurisdictions. They either had territorial issues, or like, this is my my jurisdiction, your jurisdiction is over there. Either that would get in the way, or the fact that even if they wanted to communicate, they couldn't very easily. You'd have to put a quarter in, to talk on the on a payphone, unless they were like, in the next county, and then it cost even more. So as opposed to, while I was investigating this with the current head of the criminal investigation division here in Orange County, North Carolina, he was getting texts from a detective over in Durham about a case that they both had their fingers in, and so they can talk instantaneously.
Mm-hmm.
When back then they just couldn't. There was one funny story that they were telling me, and I loved hearing cops tell old 70s stories and stuff. But out here in Chapel Hill, they had this thing called Coke bottle dispatch, where they didn't all have radios in their car. So they were required, as they patrolled the area, to drive past the police station. And if they had put a Coke bottle in the window to hold the window open, that means that they needed to report in because there was a call. So they call it Coke bottle dispatch. And then your job was just to drive and then pass the station to see if the Coke bottle is up in the window. And that's how they communicated back in the early 70s. And that's not a lie.
Wow. Yeah, it's hard to comprehend. I've asked this question a lot of various writers on the show, because that have come from law enforcement, or like Jim Latwell has been on the show several times, and he lives close by me here in this area, and he's got a lot of stories from his years working in the prison system, but I'm always reminded of this story. I've got his David Simon, who wrote The Wire, tells a story about being grilled one time about the show, and about there's a scene in one of the episodes of The Wire where Omar jumps out of the fourth story of a parking garage to get away from the guys chasing him, and he survives. And so somebody later was asking David Simon, so that, there was probably a lot that you embellished, right? I mean, that didn't really happen, right? I mean, a guy wouldn't jump out of the fourth story and survive. You changed that, right? And he said, no, you're right. That's true. That's not exactly what happened. The real person that Omar was based on. It's true that he jumped out of a parking garage to escape the guys chasing him, but it was actually the sixth story, not the fourth. But I said, no one's ever going to believe that. So I made it the fourth story to give it just a little bit more plausibility. And, that always blows people away, because they always think you're going the other direction. And so he had to soften the reality of it, because no one would believe that. The Coke bottle story, that sounds almost like that. Like, it's so unbelievable to my modern ear that it's hard to even envision that is a time when law enforcement was that prehistoric in their ability to maneuver. Were there other things that you came across like that where you said, I just can't even use that in the
Oh, absolutely. There were so many when we were researching the original case for 2.5 years. There would be so many things where we would look at each other and say, man, if this was in a book or a movie, no one would believe it. And even when I was adapting the story for fiction, there were things I just, either they were in there and somewhere in the editing process it was pointed out to me. They were like, hey, this this would never happen. And I'm like, but it did. But the last thing you want to do when you're telling a fiction story is distract the reader. So sometimes you would, like David Simon did, you would just leave it out. For example, in the real life case, the two victims that were kidnapped, they were parking in a 1968 Ford Cortina and in a cul-de-sac in a housing development that hadn't been built yet. And it turned out that night there was another couple in a 1968 Ford Cortina that were being targeted by a couple of bullies. And so, just the odds of that, but like, if you're writing a fiction story, that just sends you off on a whole other plot line, that would actually stretch people's, believability.
Right. It's interesting too. So the big part of the big plot here is, of course, the podcast that in the modern timeline, you have the two people trying to put together the podcast. And this is a real thing now. True crime has become such a big thing. And of course, you have your own experience with podcasting. And, and I'm going to ask you some questions too about your filmmaking and screenwriting. But just staying on this has become such a part now of, I've seen it now in a few different storylines where a podcast is part of the storyline because it's become a way of delivering stories that has become so popular. But there's room there often, at least in storytelling, for maybe some shady ethical aspects of how people go about getting their stories. Give me a little insight, I guess, into, clearly you had experience with your own podcast, but give me some insight into maybe how you approached weaving that part of it into the storytelling, because you could have chosen any format for these two modern sleuths to go about it. It could have been two reporters, it could have been two new cops, anybody, but the podcast clearly was an obvious choice. So give me a little insight into how you decided to go about doing that.
Well, of course, that was where I had experience. So I did find, I had never done it before. So everything was new and everything was fascinating and everything was a challenge. And so I did want to try and communicate that, in particular but like one thing you've got to watch with the podcast is there's not a whole lot of journalistic oversight. So like if the New York Times say we're doing a piece, they're going to have fact checkers and they have an editorial board and, it goes through so many things before we actually read it that, like, you get a sense that for the most part, you're reading something that can be verified as true. And for the most part, hopefully unbiased, as opposed to a podcast where, literally people can just record something and then upload it and it's put out there. And so if you name a suspect, it's, that you could get sued. You could get sued. Now, where we found, we talked to a lot of lawyers, and where we found the loophole there was you get them to confirm that they were named as a suspect. So, if I'm interviewing you and I say, so the police, is it true the police identified you as a suspect? And I say, well, they did, but I didn't do it. Well, now they've just said they were a suspect. And so therefore, when we say he's a suspect, we're taking his words. So that was kind of the trick. And there was a bunch of those where it was like, get them to say this before you ask any questions, because once they say it, then everything is off the board. But going back to my point, though, is you are dealing with, in cases such as those, in a lot of podcasts, you are dealing with, the biases of whoever is uploading the thing. And the fewer people involved, that's, clear. It's more clear what the bias is. I will turn on some podcasts sometimes where, just right away from the beginning, they're going to they identify this is going to be the story about how the cops drop the ball at every, and so, yeah, these people hate cops. And again, I do not look at cops as infallible. I know that there are very, very good ones, and I know that there are very, very bad ones. But you want to try to remove as much of that as you can when you're telling the story. Try to deal with it even. And so in the fiction, when I'm adapting that, I made sure that both of the characters that were researching it, they had their own agenda, and their agendas were coming through. And whether you responded to that or respected it or despised it or whatever, it's up to the reader and how they interpret the agenda and the actions of the characters, which I think, to even put a difference. So when we were interviewing the real life suspect, he was really, really good at deflecting what he had done, to the point that thoughts came into my head several times. Oh my God, we're picking on an 80-year-old man. Like, we're accusing an 80. I've got all this hidden listening devices and a hidden camera, and we're coming in here and getting this 80-year-old man to talk under false pretenses and etc. And he may not have done it. But there, but as we found out later, he, if in the small chance he was not guilty of that, he was guilty of several other things that made me not feel as bad anymore.
Right. Well, so along those lines, because a lot of your stories in the past have featured protagonists that were on the other side of the law, right? Bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
But something bad wrong is coming from the other perspective, that of law enforcement and these two podcasters who are trying to solve a murder, even if it's for their own selfish reasons. They're on the correct side of the law, so if you're going to frame it that way. How was that for you, coming from this perspective this time, as opposed from the bad guy, but this time coming from the good guys? And do you see yourself doing more stories from the police side of the perspective, as opposed to the bad guy side of the perspective?
Well, in the other, like, first of all, one thing I really enjoy writing about is just kind of like the darker nature of humans, and whether you're the protagonist of the story or you're the antagonist, the dark sides of us are what I find enjoyment out of more. I love the stories about them, because there may be things I'll never do, or they're things that, like, maybe I've been angry and thought about doing but I would never do, or whatever. So the darker side, we all have dark sides to us, and whether we access them or not, those are just always my interest. And in the past, the previous 3 books, they were written from the points of view of the more criminal element, because you write what previous to my investigations, though I didn't have, the only access I had to police were, when I was getting in trouble for something. People I grew up with weren't always the best of people. I grew up in a small town with some pretty bad guys in there, on both sides of the law. So that's kind of what I knew. I started working on this, and next thing you know, I'm allowed access into the sheriff's office. I'm hanging out with off-duty, retired, current, investigators and cops, and talking with them. My roommate in Dallas for years was a Dallas cop. And I can say that, as far as like people that skirt the line of what's legal or illegal, or the dark sides, this on both sides of the law, man. Even my character, is lying about the fact that he's got Alzheimer's, and he's trying to get his pension and keep it secret from everybody what he's doing. So we got to play with that. The sheriff himself, might have had, he was I always look at him like he was a good man, but maybe that there were things that he did that might not be looked at as good, depending on who you're asking. So I'm always going to be interested by that. My experience of working on, the long dance exposed me to a lot of how investigations are done, and I found that fascinating. What limitations and restrictions they have, why people are not able to be prosecuted, and even in some cases, when we read that, we saw some unethical things investigators would do in order to catch the right guy. They've got the right guy, they just can't put it on him, so they would do these things to try and put it on it, and that would just cause it even more problems, which of course is the basis of like every noir storyline. So that worked out for me.
Well, and Yeah, I really appreciate a lot of those perspectives because it is an absolute fact that nobody in this world is perfect. We tend to, in our modern world, we want to make everything black and white, right? Whether
We're
it's
all the bad guy in somebody else's story. We're the villain in somebody else's story.
and we're the good guy in our own story. I mean, this is
Absolutely.
absolutely human nature that, and whether we're doing it in politics or in sports or in down to the books and movies we like, right? We tend to see everything in such black and white terms, and yet human beings are not black and white. We all make mistakes. We all have, as you noted, this dark side. And I grew up with some guys too. A couple of them that ended up in prison for doing very bad things. And I don't know. I think it was weird because again, my brother was a cop. My brother's quite a bit older than me too. So it just there was a lot of weird dynamics there, but it kept me from doing anything stupid because I always believed, no, that's the last thing in the world I want to do is get in that kind of trouble. But the possibilities are always there, and you just think sometimes there, but for the grace of God or one more beer or whatever it is, it could have been you that did that dumb thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you pay for. And I think it's one of the beautiful things about crime fiction is so often, you know, it's a fairly standard theme is, someone who's not necessarily a bad person does something really stupid, and then they spend the rest of their time trying to overcome that. Um, I want to ask you about a specific part of that of noir, which is Southern noir, because I have seen a lot of the folks who talk about your work. You've been described as a master of modern Southern noir, and there's all kinds of things within noir, and I know Southern noir is a category, but I don't know that I understand exactly what that entails. Could you tell me what makes it different from other forms of noir under that overall umbrella of noir crime fiction?
Well, I mean, it seems like a majority of the stories that in the past have fallen into noir were, took place in like urban landscapes, and specifically perhaps, LA, Chicago, New York. So, so I don't, growing up, like, I went to college, got my literature degree, where you're reading the classics, and I just never really felt like, the bond with those. And as I started reading crime fiction, like you're getting a lot of those urban landscapes, and being where I'm from, I didn't necessarily feel the connection with that. But the book that kind of taught me that, like, where I'm from and what I've observed and, my interest was a book called Agatite by Clay Reynolds. And it was also published as under the title Rage as a paperback for a little while. So you can either find it as Agatite or Rage, but it takes place in a small, dusty Texas town, and it is also told on dual timelines. And it was just, they spend 3/4 of the book setting up the last quarter, and that last quarter is just a kaboom. And I remember thinking, this is probably the closest thing to a perfect book. And I've spent the rest of my life ripping it off. Like I find little things in there all the time where I'm like, it'll be a character's name, it'll be something, the dual time. I think every one of my books is modeled after a Clay Reynolds technique that he used in Agatha. And I've told him that. He recently passed, but I told him that any opportunity I got, mostly because he would forget me every time, but he was a great man. So after reading that, I was like, what Clay Reynolds did was show that, like, my background and my interests and where I came from and etc. has value. You can turn it into something that could be interesting to readers. And then after that, that's what I did. There's all sorts of things in the South or in these rural landscapes that, folks in New York and LA don't have to deal with. Like, for instance, like black snakes. I go out in my yard, like last night, like I told you, it was in the 80s. Last night I went out to my, garden to pick some basil and some thyme. And I gotta watch out for snakes. Everything I do, I gotta watch out for snakes. People in the city don't have to deal with it. It's fucking frightening, down here in the South. And that's just the animals. Sometimes the people are pretty mean too, but like, you have if you're looking for people that can justify shitty behavior, it is historically dripping off of every tree, building, and graveyard in the South. Um, we can go piece by piece, but I think everybody knows what we're talking about. I mean, this is an area that is just rich in, the sins of humanity, and everything you try to do to overcome them, you can get swallowed up in real easy. So I think with the historical significance, the landscape, the people, everything, Southern noir to me is just, it's fast. And the people that handle it really well too are, I think a lot of times they do get overlooked because they don't write about those, those settings, but the themes are there. The themes are there just as much. And of course, we all know S.A. Cosby, Steve Weddle. He's got a new book that's going to be coming out in January. I've already read. I already know it's going to be the best book I read all the next year. He's great. I have an entire shelf right behind me just of my Southern noir people. Daniel Woodrell, William Gay. So it's fascinating stuff to me when done right.
Yeah, you mentioned Cosby. I love his work too, and I don't think your work is. I wouldn't say your work is similar, other than there is a feel. I mean, as you're talking, I can really understand what you're saying, and I would add something else. So I lived in Washington D.C. for a little while, and I visited the South quite a few different times, but not remotely trying to act like I know something I don't. But the one thing that always strikes me about being on the other side of the Rockies, since I'm a California person, is the humidity. It, I mean, it took me forever to get used to it when we were living over there, and I don't know if I ever really did. But when I'm reading something, whether it's yours or someone else's who's rooted in the South, I can feel that when it's really good writing. That's something I can feel, is that sense of, because it feels oppressive to me, right? And it changes your mood. And it really does. When you exit the house at 6 a.m, you're like, God damn it. So I'm already sweating. It changes your whole how you interact with people. And so that's a big part of it for me, is just that little bit about the environment. Like, I wasn't thinking of snakes, but I was thinking of the temperature.
The snakes, like, you can't even go outside like without, there's normal things people want to do. Like, hey, I go to turn on the sprinkler every day, and when I'm reaching through those bushes to turn on that spigot, like every time I've got to stomp my feet or whatever. There's just things you got to do to make sure you don't get bit by a snake. And I'm like, not everybody lives like this. Not everybody lives.
That is so true.
If you look at black snakes, by the way, are territorial biting snakes. That if especially like a black racer is a territorial black biting snake that will chase you to keep you out of their area. So it's what people that are afraid of snakes are afraid of. Everyone says, "Oh, that snake don't want to bother you." Well, the black snake will chase you, and if it catches you, now it's not poisonous, so you'll just get bit. But everyone says, "Oh, that's a good snake to have around because it keeps the copperheads away," which are poison. They're venomous, and so like I live in a neighborhood where an aggressive, territorial, fast snake is a good thing. That's how messed up this is. They're like, "Oh yeah, that's a good thing. Make sure that you want a black snake."
Okay, I don't envy that, not at all. So I do want to ask you about your filmmaking career, because you've been a screenwriter and a filmmaker. You've made a lot of short films. I did a short film on my own about 12 years ago, and I produced it and wrote it and directed it, and it was part of a special project, and it was really fun. And I'm a political reporter and editor by trade, and so I was able to get access to some really cool building stuff here in the Capitol, and so it was a lot of fun. No, I'm in no danger of anyone confusing me with Steven Spielberg. But tell me a bit about your screenwriting experiences, because I know how much work it is, and I know how much goes into even a short film. And so I'm curious, what was your experience like there? Are we going to see another Eryk Pruitt movie anytime soon? Tell me a little bit about that part of your creative side.
Man, classes, like continuing education courses, and was in part of a screenwriting group in Dallas. It was a lot of fun. And I sold a short script, and I'd won another contest and used that money to go to college. Neither of those scripts got made, but I'd made some money, but nobody would ever see it. And that was just kind of a bummer because, you know, you're not getting girls to talk to you at a bar. Oh, I sold this script. And then, oh, can I watch it? No, you can't watch it. Like, it's never been made. So, you know, I kind of had put that aside until I was out here in Durham. And one night I wrote, you know, I was waiting tables. My wife and I were both waiting tables. We'd had a hard weekend. And so one night I wrote a screenplay just to make her laugh after the end of a really shitty week of shifts. And when I read it out to her at the end of the night, we're having our drinks, and I read the script. She was laughing so hard. And she's like, "You need to get this made somehow." I'm like, "Yeah, good luck." Well, fast forward a couple months later, and two filmmakers are in my bar, the bar where I was working, and they were complaining about how they'd been doing documentary films, but they'd never seen a narrative script that was worth filming. And I told the other waiters, I was like, "Y'all watch my section. I'll be right back." And I hauled ass home, ran out the back door, hauled ass home, went through my file cabinet, pulled out that script and brought it to them. And then fast forward like a year later, it was made and then submitted. It had won 16 film festivals internationally, was in even more, upwards of 40 film festivals. And it kind of got to be like a little darling of the film festival circuit that year. And then after that, people were asking me all the time. It's mostly, I think I found a pretty neat niche market of actors that were unsatisfied with the lack of roles or diversity in roles they were getting. And so they would pay me to either adapt one of my short stories or write a script for them so that they could take it and feature their own acting skills or directing skills and enter them into film festivals. So I became like this little film festival screenwriter. And it was fun. I mean, there wasn't any money, but then the question was, you know, like I said, talking to girls in the bar, do you want to be the guy that got money for a script that was never made, or who made a bunch of scripts that were you never got paid for? So, you know, easily I'll choose the, you know, getting your work out there, because film festivals are a lot of fun to go to. And, you know, you don't see too many shorts, don't really have a big money making market. You know, they're basically out there to showcase the talent of the people involved, the directors, the writer, the actors. And so that's a lot of fun. You go to the film festivals, you get to be a little celebrity for like, you know, a weekend, and then you go back home to your, you know, job type job. So so they were a lot of fun. They were a lot of fun. I got to stretch some things. As far as would I do another one, it's a lot of work and a lot of money, and a lot of personalities. You got to deal with a lot of, you know, a lot of people and manage all that. But here recently, you know, I own my own bar now, and we do these nights where we've been reading these scripts in front of the audience that, you know, you're finding out that these people I know on an everyday basis have like acting chops, and it's fun to watch them perform stuff. So I'm flirting with the idea of us just getting some money and a crew together and taking one of my stories and seeing what we can do.
Well, I will look forward to that. I watched one of your films, Foodie.
That's the one. That's the one that went to
Right,
our
right. Yeah, I knew that's what you're talking about. That's on YouTube. I enjoyed that quite a bit. Like I say, I really have a lot of respect for short filmmakers because you know, now, of course, I know how much time, money, effort, personalities. Oh God, just I had, you know, I was filming one part of our story in the Senate Pro Tem's meeting office and his personal office, and I'd known him for years, and before he was in the Pro Tem position and all that shit. Anyway, long story short, I had a lot of kids that were part of this movie, right? And as we're moving the crew in, I had this moment of terror because there's all of these things that have been collected by all the pro tems since the 1850s that are on display in this office and in this meeting room. And I'm thinking, I've got 6, you know, grade school age kids in here and this crew, and there's ladders and booms and cameras and all this shit. And I thought, if I break all of this stuff is irreplaceable, there is not a single replaceable item in here outside of a light bulb. And I am going to be so screwed. So I you know, I was directing with I think my hands were shaking, but we got through the whole thing and no drama. But those are the little things that when it's you writing your typewriter, that's one thing, or you're at your computer, that's one thing. When you got to manage all those other people and
Oh
all,
yeah.
oh my God, permits and insurance and craft services, and it's like here the union, it can get to be really complex really really fast. So kudos to you for doing that, and I'll definitely be watching to see if you take on any other ones. um so you mentioned you own a bar. I'm really curious because I know so many of the bars and restaurants around the country just really got hit hard by the pandemic. How did you get through the pandemic with your bar? Because I mean, all of us would love to say, yeah, we're making our living writing, but that's such a small percentage of the writing community. How was that experience for you guys?
It was hard. It was frustrating. There's a lot of anger too, especially our government officials, because out here in North Carolina, they were rightfully um, one of the more restrictive communities, which I'm for that. But then they would make these stupid decisions like, okay, restaurants can open, bowling alleys can open, breweries can open, but like my bar can't. And so like stupid stuff like that, so it was very frustrating. And then when we did open, we required masks. We even had a vaccine mandate for a while, so it was like we were responsible to the tone of like how our state and community was being responsible. But there was that period there where we weren't even given the opportunity to show that we could be responsible, so that was frustrating. And it caused me to say a couple of things to our government officials that got my Twitter banned. Got me kicked off Twitter a couple of times. I think I challenged our governor to a duel. Just crazy things. But I think everybody was going a little crazy during that period. As far as like business goes, we were able to sell retail only. So we had to transition into selling 6-packs, and we bought a frozen drink machine, and we're selling these wine slushies, and the community really showed up and bought those wine slushies. Then when we were allowed to open, we were only allowed to open outdoors, which we didn't have an outdoor section, but our neighbors allowed us to set up tables in front of their storefronts, and our town kind of backed us. So we got through because our community allowed us to modify, and so it was cool. And then when we were finally able to open up again, everything was groovy. As far as paying the bills go, I secretly ghost wrote romance novels, which was some of the worst money, the dirtiest money I've ever made in my life. I would not recommend it to anyone. There's nothing more humiliating than your two female bosses giving you lots and lots and lots of red ink on your sex scenes, giving you notes. It's humiliating, but I did it. I cashed the checks. I'll never tell anyone the pen names. I'll just let that shame exist.
Oh
We all did things in COVID we're not proud of,
well,
myself included.
the revelations that happen on this show, that's awesome. But that's a huge market. I've never I well, back before I started doing this on video, and it was just the blog, I had a romance writer on. She did paranormal romance.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's so many the genres within the genre of romance.
Oh my God. Oh, we were doing Small Town Billionaires. This is a series I was doing, Small Town Billionaires. And they wanted me to do multiple of this. And I'm like, well, how many billionaires live in a small town? Like all of a sudden they were like, all right, so it's the same town, but it's this other billionaire in the town. And I'm like, they have all kinds of crazy secret baby. That's the whole thing. Like people that have secret babies. But one of my favorites that made me laugh was Old West bear shifter romances, where it's stories in the Old West where a man can shift into a bear. And when my friend told me that, she was like, yeah, I'm writing these Old West bear shifter romances. And I was like, I went and Googled it, and they like even had a thing where it's like top 5 Old West bear shifter romance writers. And so I printed that out and I brought it to her, and I was like, you weren't kidding. Look, there's a top 5 list. And she looked over the list. She goes, yeah, I'm 3 of them. And I was like, so it just goes to show you, man, there's a lucrative career out there if you want it, but it's dirty money.
Oh yeah. Well, I have a friend uh in South Carolina. Um and she's done a lot of books, and some of them have gone indie and some are traditional, a few self-published, but she's a consultant that has done a lot of stuff over the years. But she says without question the thing that allows her to actually have an income and be a homeowner and all those things is she writes um this series of erotic books that she sells only on Amazon under a pen name. She says, I sell the shit out of those, right? I
Hmm.
just sell the hell out of those. And those are the ones that make me my living because, and some ghostwriting, other stuff, and some consulting things here, but those are hit and miss. And sometimes you're really good. And then, sometimes you have to fight people to pay you and all this stuff. She says the erotic stuff is a check every, on the regular. And I sell the hell out. I can't write them fast enough. That's just whatever else you think about the human animal, man. We are driven by some stuff. That's all I can say. We are driven by some stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So
They had the whole.
I want to ask you the two-part question, and then we'll wrap this up here. But who's your favorite crime writer working today, and maybe who inspired you the most coming up?
Whoa. Well, I mean, it would be impossible to pick one. I mean, I think that the easy answer is right now, Cosby's hitting it. Me and him used to, take road trips selling our books out the trunk of our car because wouldn't nobody else, they weren't getting sold either, any other way. So it's great to see somebody like him just really killing it. But like, I already mentioned Clay Reynolds. Unfortunately, he's passed on 2 years ago. But even though he doesn't publish much anymore, if you get an opportunity to read any books by Jedediah Ayres, it's Ayres. You need to jump on it. They're hard to find now because a lot of them went out of print. But like he was one of those. It's just you pick it up. It's a short story. It's a novel. It's a novella. Whatever it is, you're about to get punched in the face, and from cover to cover. So he's great. I can't say enough about Jordan Harper, who I think is really coming into his right now. And then I mentioned also Steve Weddle's got, you know, I was a fan of his before I became a friend of his. And his last book, Country Hardball, is like God, came out like 10 years ago or so. So everybody's been waiting. He would post these Instagram pictures of him writing. I'm like, hurry the hell up. And his book finally comes out in January, but I got an arc and I can't wait. I can't wait for everyone to read this and for everybody to go nuts.
Um, let's just say your best friend comes to you and says, Eryk, I want to write a book. What advice do you give them?
Just start writing, you know, just start writing it. Like, don't want to write it. Don't post on Instagram that you're a writer, that you're going to be a writer. Don't quit your job, you know, just, just write it and get the draft done and don't, just get finished. And then once you're finished with it, we can see whether it's, it's something that, you want to do the work, but that's just it. It's work. It's work. It's not posting on social media. It's not it's not walking around telling girls, hey, I'm gonna be a writer. It's none of that. It's work. I want to make I'm sitting here still getting frustrated sometimes when I write a first draft. It's hard, to be good. I still, no matter how many books I write, have to remind myself all the time to just finish it. And the first draft makes it exist. The next draft's going to make it more functional. The next draft's going to make it more effective. And it's just work. Nobody likes to think that. They like to think that I went home, I spent a weekend in a hotel somewhere, and now a book is coming out next week. But yeah, it's work.
Yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions about publishing, and I think I think there's so many people they don't realize how small the percentage of writers that get they're on the Today Show and all that other stuff, right? It's a very small percentage. Most of it is grinding it out through a lot of rejection and a lot of drafts, like selling books out of your car, whatever it takes. There's just a lot of that going on, and I so greatly admire so many of the writers that I've met through doing this show, because nobody had it easy. Nobody sat down, wrote, that first thing, that first draft, went out, got an agent, got a big 5 contract, and then just got that career going. And that's how it is. Nobody that I know has done that. Everybody has had to just slog through the quagmire and decide 1,000 times not to quit, because it's so easy to want to just say, fuck this. I'm just, I'm out of here. I don't want to.
My first novel, Dirtbags, is still the novel I think I'm the most proud of, because it's just lean and mean, and there wasn't a wasted word, and everything was. So it's the one I'm most proud of. Probably couldn't be published today because of some of the things that go on there. However, when I was querying for that, sending off to agents, publishers, everything, I sent it off to everyone and was getting rejections. It got to a point, at 6 months, where it was like, if I don't wake up and find at least one rejection in my inbox, that means I didn't work hard enough. I was going to go until everybody had rejected me before I said no. But before I said okay, but like eventually one day the acceptance letter did come in, and I didn't even, almost deleted it just because out of reflex, because I'd never seen one of those before. I stared at that thing for like 20 minutes, like, is this for real? It turned out to have been accepted by some paranormal romance publishing company, where like the editor, who had always liked crime, I guess had some drinks and was like, you know what, I'm gonna just do it, and thankfully, but that's all it took for me to get started. But yeah, that's just it. It was worth every day submitting to somebody, knowing you were 85% chance of getting rejected, but still just doing it anyway.
Yeah, that's a big part of this. Well, I like to end on a fun question, and I hope it's a fun question. I mean for it to be one. Let's just say I had this magical power. I can put you together with one of the following 3 people for whatever, drinks at your bar, conversation about writing, whatever it is. You can pick one of the following 3. Who would you choose? The options I'm going to give you are the great crime writer Jim Thompson, the great actor James Cagney, or the real life gangster Ma Barker. One of those 3. Who would you want to sit down and chat with for a bit?
Oh, Ma Barker, hands down. Oh my God. Yeah, Ma Barker. I mean, like, Jim Thompson, I love reading his books, but like, based on what I've seen of his biography, he probably would not be fun to have drinks with. I would read anything he wrote right now. Cagney, I think he's fascinating. He's a song and dance man. Nobody ever. So he was a song, and he wanted to be a musical actor. He's a song and dance man. But like, the gangster stuff just got him going. But like Ma Barker, I mean, she even has. We even kind of both have our Dallas ties. I think I would never get. I don't think I would ever get tired of the conversation I could have with Ma Barker, hands down.
Well, there you go. There you go. I love that when there's definitive answer here, and for you, it's Ma Barker. Well, Eryk, thanks so much for coming on the show. This has been great. I love. I love it. I hope it comes across how much I love talking to authors about their work.
Thank you so much.
I really mean it when I say it too. Eryk's really, truly one of the best crime writers you're going to read on the front today. Check it out. If you haven't seen his work, check it out. It is really, really good. Not only do you know how to turn a phrase, you know how to keep those pages turning, man, and that's what we look for in these books. So kudos.
Thank you so very much, Rich. Thank you so very much.
Absolutely, it was great meeting you in San Diego. I look forward to us seeing each other again somewhere in the future. I will remind folks, I didn't do my normal commercial at the beginning, so give me just a moment here. If you haven't hit subscribe, whether you're on YouTube or whatever podcast platform you use, please do so. And if you'd be so kind as to leave a review, it really does help other people find the show. And I believe, look, if you have any interest at all in writers, either becoming one yourself or just would like to know something about the game, this is a good way to do it, because these folks are generous enough with their time to come on and share all of these insights with you for nothing, just the cost of your time. And if you're interested in writing, this is the way to do it, man. I'm telling you, you're getting a master class from master writers. Can't emphasize that enough. So please hit that subscribe button. It does help everybody, even folks you don't know. So for my guest, Eryk Pruitt, for myself, Rich Eisen, for my two crazy ass English setters who are here behind me, always my colleagues here, they have cooperated yet again. I'm going to leave you with the last thing that I always leave you with, which I mean from the bottom of my heart. Tomorrow is not promised to any of us, so make today count. All right, until next time, this has been the Open Mic.